Is parking getting easier because of the new parking structure?
Yep.
Yep, okay. Internet doesn't seem to connect, so I'm going to try another browser. All right, so what we're going to do today is to continue our discussion with hardware. What we talked about the other day on Tuesday, how to record sound. That process is called recording, but it's also, more specifically, it's called digitization. Okay. In other words, we're taking something that is really smooth, that is a continuous function, and turning into something that is quote-unquote discrete. In other words, we are only using integers to represent the values. So that's what we were doing on the other day. And we'll go ahead and start a new session.
iSweasel.
iSweasel, which is the same as Firefox. They just changed the name a little bit here. Because the Mozilla organization does not let people recompile their binary, recompile the open source software, and call it, Firefox. So that's why these people, running Debian, which is an open source repository, have to rename their product, to something that is slightly different.
Ah.
Yep. So they have Ice Dove instead of Firebird or Thunderbird. Huh? The email client.
Oh, all right.
Yep. Go ahead.
You said digitization as well?
Digitization. Okay, so let's look up that word because that's basically what I explained on the other day. It's called digitization. There we go. For some reason, my flash drive is becoming kind of slow, so I might have to go back and use an external hard drive instead. I think it has to do with being flash based. It's just it slows down over time. It was really fast to begin with, and then it just kind of slows down a little bit, and now it's to the point where it's not really that usable anymore. There we go. All right, so digitization. Digitization is the representation of an object, image, sound, document, or signal. In this case, on Tuesday we talked about audio signal. Okay, because sound is really just audio signal, and by a discrete set of its points or samples, and the result is called digital representation. So that's basically what we have been doing, or what I have been trying to explain, is the digitization of audio, it's basically sound wave. Okay, so we'll go back and take a look at the picture. I hope you guys are drawing pictures or taking a picture of what I drew the other time. Okay, so sound wave itself, if you look at, well, this is actually after conversion. Okay, so we're looking at the voltage, which is the electrical potential coming out of the microphone, and this is time. Okay, so we are looking at a voltage change that is continuous. Okay, a sine wave is a continuous, function. For those of you who have taken, calculus or some other math classes, you might remember what it means to be continuous. Do you guys still remember what is continuous? If you pick, any 2 points, okay, within the curve, you have to find every single value in between. They're all connected. Okay, we cannot record something like this. Okay, because it is continuous. It will require an infinite amount of bits to represent something as simple as this. And we only have a limited amount of memory in the computer on the hard drive, and we can only transmit so much information over the network, within a certain amount of time. So that means we cannot truly represent the voltage change over time, but instead what we can do is to approximate it. Okay, so what we're doing is to sample. Okay, last time we talked about for each sample, it is not okay to be just 0 or 1 because the representation is not even close to what it is supposed to be. Is that okay? So was that okay?
Yeah.
Because if it is just zeros and ones, that means yeah, this one I can see as a 1 and this one I can see as a 0. But what about the stuff in between? Well, we have a transition from here to here, from 1 to 0, and then from 0 back to 1, and then from 1 back to 0, and so on. The square wave here, okay, the one that is rectangular, is not really a truthful representation of the actual sine wave. Okay, when you listen to it, if I do represent this sine wave using the kind of square wave here, you will actually hear the same tone, the same frequency, but it won't sound even close to the original wave. Okay, you will hear distortion. Particularly in this case, you will actually hear some harmonics. For people who play musical instruments, harmonics has to do with doubling the frequency, the main frequency, quadrupling, multiplied by 8, and so on, and the distribution of the various frequencies that are multiples of the primary one are called harmonics. Yep.
You mean if both of those were played at once?
If you play one first and then play the other one, you will hear that they are actually the same frequency. Yeah. So you can say, okay, they are the same tone, but they are different. They have different quote unquote texture. It's almost like comparing the sound coming out of a bell, which is very close to a true sine wave, and the sound coming out of a violin, which is not even close to a sine wave.
PhD is what gives every sound its own temper. Whatever.
Right, but the sound coming out of a violin, even though it's the same sound, even though it's the same note, will be completely different from the sound coming out of a trumpet or the sound coming out of a flute. Okay, and those are all harmonics. So that's what I'm trying to illustrate here. Is even though they are the same tone, the same the same notes basically, but they are different. Okay, they have different texture to it. Okay, so binary is not good. So we talked about how we can divide it into some more levels instead of having only 2 levels. Let's say we have 4 levels. So from here to here, it will be represented by this value. And then from here to here, it will be another value. So we are dividing it into even more divisions. And we are getting closer and closer to the actual waveform as we increase the number of levels, or increase the number of intermediate values that we can represent. Do you guys still remember we talked about that? Kind of? Okay. So eventually, we basically come to the conclusion that let's go from 0 down here all the way up to 65,000. What is that number? 2 to the power of 16. Somebody actually remember that number. 65,536. Okay, thank you. Okay, so, but this is the last value we can represent is actually 1 less than that. Okay, so if we divide this entire thing into 65,536 different values, then it gets pretty close to the original waveform, and most people cannot hear the difference anymore. In other words, if you have a really good headphone, and you are playing, and you're listening to a recording, a live concert that is, transmitted, by, audio means, analog means, versus playing a recorded session but digitized to 16-bit per sample, most people cannot tell the difference. Okay, it is good enough for most people. For studio purposes, a lot of times they go for 18-bit representation, which means the number of divisions is multiplied by 4, which is really, really high definition. Yep, go ahead.
What is it referring to when it talks about bitrate?
Now bitrate, okay, that's a good question, but that's a question that I can answer only after we talk about sampling rate and also encoding. Okay, so keep that question in your mind because it's a very good question. Okay, so this is all good, but the other factor to control how truthfully you can reproduce sound has to do with sampling rate. Okay, what is sampling rate? So let me just redraw this picture here. And I believe the Wikipedia page, has discussions of all of these topics too. So audio signals to digital, which is something that we talked about earlier. Implications of digitization. So we'll come back and look at this to see if it covers the same material. Okay, let's talk about sampling. So once again, we have this sine wave here. And this time, we'll just look at digitization. Let's say we have infinite resolution. In other words, we can represent exactly the value at a particular point. However, I'm only paying attention, I'm only digitizing at certain points in time. So let's just say that I'm digitizing here, I'm digitizing here, 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 and here. Okay. So these are the points in time when I actually look at the voltage and convert it into a number and then store that number. So the resulting waveform, when I replay this recording, I'm trying to pick a different color, black is good. Okay, so when I try to replay it, it will look like this. The waveform that I'm actually replaying will look kind of like this. What do you think this will sound like, the black one? Do you think it will sound just like the blue one, or do you think it will be not exactly the same? Not exactly the same, because you see all these jagged edges here, all the right angles and stuff like that. That means this waveform is not going to reproduce very truthfully, because in this case it has nothing to do with the sampling resolution, which is how many divisions we divide vertically. This has to do with how frequently we are sampling. Is that making sense okay so far? Okay. Let's look at the picture. I'm trying to look for a different color. Oh, thank you. It's been hiding from me. Okay, so let's double it. Okay, thank you. So let's go ahead and double it. So the red lines represent additional points in time where I will do some recording or digitization. So these are all the additional points where I will do some, I will digitize the voltage at those particular times. So now I have the red one would look like this, because it is combining both the blue ones as well as the red ones. What do you think?
Better.
Would this be a little bit better? If you look at the red line, is that a little bit closer to the blue line compared to the black one? Quite a bit better, okay? And the red line versus the blue line has nothing to do with resolution, which is how many levels can we record. This can be from 0 to 65,535, the same, exactly the same. We're just increasing the frequency, which is how many times we are converting the voltage into a value to store on the computer. Are we doing okay so far? Yep.
What was this called again?
It is called sampling rate. So we have two factors controlling the quality of the quality of this sound recorded. One is called the sampling rate, which is measured in hertz. How many times per second? Okay, so this is basically how many times per second. The other factor has to do with the sampling resolution, which means for each sample, every single time we convert the voltage into a number, what is the range of that number? That is the sampling resolution. So we have sampling resolution. And both of these are important. You can have one or the other, then the sound will still be kind of not really truthful to what it originally was. Yep.
What's the unit that you would see for the sampling resolution?
In terms of resolution, the most common way to quantify that is the number of bits. Okay, so in this case, it has to do with number of bits per sample. And bit, the BIT stands for binary digit. The B comes from the binary, and then the IT comes from the end of digit.
What is binary integer? What is binary integer?
I think it's binary digit. Let's look it up. Bit, binary, digit. And there you go. So a bit is a contraction of binary digit. But at least according to Wikipedia, you can change it if you want to. That's the nice thing about Wikipedia. But then some people will dig it up and try to find out exactly where that word comes from. But according to the current version of Wikipedia, it is binary digit. Okay, so are we still doing okay so far? We doing good? All right. All right, so let's try to figure out some math here. In other words, let's go ahead and try to find out what is the appropriate sampling rate. Okay, we have already determined that 16-bit for resolution, which will give us values from 0 to 65,535, is already sufficient. Most people cannot tell the difference after this point. So in terms of sampling resolution, 16-bit is good. The question now is, what about sampling rate? Okay, how many times should we do these conversions per second so that the sound would sound like the original? You can no longer tell what is the original and what is recorded. That's the question. Okay. How high of a frequency can you distinguish? You can actually hear and perceive.
20,000.
Okay, some people can go all the way up to 20,000 or 20 kilohertz. Okay, in other words, the oscillation, the waveform, is oscillating 20,000 times per second. Okay, and that's the ceiling of most people. Human beings can only go up to about 20,000. Other animals like rats and bats, rodents, can go much higher. Okay, I think they can go up. They can get past 40,000, possibly up to the 100,000 hertz range, and that's why they can use echolocation.
Yeah, like radar, like sonar with bats.
Yeah, it's called echolocation. But basically it's based on the same concept. Yep.
There's a blind guy that can echolocate.
Really?
Yeah,
So
it's
you
really
can
cool.
click.
Yeah, he clicks these little. I saw a video of it, and it was like this little black guy, and he just would click and tell you where things were.
Wow. But bats can not only tell you how far something is, they can actually have a three-dimensional picture of where various objects are, when they're in flight. Yep.
That's when it bouncing off, though.
It's a little more than that. There's a lot more signal processing than that. Yep, go ahead.
It was just weird because he mentioned it was I saw the same kind of thing, but it was with a completely different guy. He was able to actually tell what the object was. He was able to say this is a car and whatnot. It was really cool. Because
That
he was
might have-
familiar with how big and how the sounds would reverberate.
The quality of the sound, when
Yeah.
it bounces back, because a metallic object has a different way compared to, let's say, a wooden object.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's still amazing. Okay. Because to us, that's not something that we think we can do. But to people without sight, well, they develop their other senses. Okay. Very good. Okay. So let's go ahead and just establish that 20,000 hertz or 20 kilohertz is the ceiling of human hearing. Now, in order to truthfully represent frequencies up to 20,000 hertz, the sampling has to be twice of that. Okay. If you want to understand exactly why that is the case, why the sampling frequency has to be at least twice of the signal that you want to capture, you have to go take a lot of classes in math and physics and engineering, because they will explain that concept in those other classes. But for us, we'll just say, okay, the sampling frequency has to be twice of the highest frequency that we want to represent. Now, since we want to represent up to 20 kilohertz, that means the sampling frequency has to be at least 40,000 hertz. Okay. In fact, we pick a really weird number as the de facto golden standard. The sampling rate, the golden standard, is 44 kilohertz. Okay, it's not 40, it's 44. Okay.
0.1.
Is it
44.1.
Is it 0.1 or 0.2?
0.1.
0.1. Okay. So that's kind of the golden standard, which means we are actually creating these points 44,100 times per second. So for every 1 second, we need 44,100 of the 16-bit values. Okay, so let's go ahead and do some math and I'll do it, here, so it will be recorded.
Is that the same thing as, like when you're in grammar school and they do the hearing test?
When you do a hearing test, they have a special equipment to do that. It's probably not recorded, it's probably generated, so you can actually dial in the exact frequency to kind of pump into the headphone. So let's do some maths here. Okay, 44.1 kilohertz of sampling rate. What does that mean? That means we are creating 44,100 samples per second. Is that okay so far? Okay, the sampling rate is basically how many times we do something per second. So each sample is a 16-bit value because we want the value to go from 0 to 65,535. Okay. So now the question is, how much storage is this going to take up? How many bytes are we going to take up? How many bits do we have in 1 byte? Okay, so 8 bits in 1 byte. So that means in this case, how many bytes do we need per second? We have this many samples per second, and then each sample is 16-bit. So in this case, we have 2 bytes per sample, right? Because one sample has 16 bits, and there are 8 bits in 1 byte. Are we doing the conversion okay so far? Kind of? Okay, 2 bytes, I'll put in parentheses here, 16 bits per sample. So for each second, we need twice of 44.1 thousand, which is 88,200 bytes to represent sound. Okay, that's it's not really a huge number, but considering this is for every second, it is still a relatively big number. Okay. So the next question is, if I want to do a 1-hour recording, how many bytes do we need? Does anyone want to kind of take on that challenge and do the math? Okay, 88,200 per second. How many seconds do we have per minute?
60.
And how many minutes per hour? Okay, so we're basically multiplying 88200 by 3600. And I'll cheat here and use a calculator. I can do the approximation thing. Okay, let's do the approximation thing because I know most of you already know how to do approximation. So the approximation is to look at the first number as 90,000, look at the second number as, I look at it as 4,000 here. So this number multiplies to what? 36, and then with 7 zeros, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. There you go. How much is that in terms of kilobytes and megabytes and stuff like that? You just go all the way to the right hand side. For every 3 zeros, you put a comma.
60 million.
So we have 360 million bytes, which is 360 megabytes. Okay. Now there are 2 different megabytes, but for the discussion, for approximation purposes, this is good enough. Or did I do my math wrong?
You want the actual number?
I think that's no, I don't need the actual number. This is just an approximation.
It's off by about 40.
It's off by about 40 million.
About 40 million?
Yeah.
Close enough. 10% is not big. It's not a big deal. As far as for this class, for this kind of purposes, it's good enough. Okay. Now, but we're forgetting one thing. This is only for recording one channel. How many people still like to listen to mono channel music instead of stereo? What if I turn off stereo on all your music instrument? Not music instruments, but all your hi-fi, iPod, iPad, whatever. Can you guys tell the difference between mono versus stereo? Which one do you like better? Stereo. Okay. So this is only for one channel. Okay. So if you want basic stereo, I'm not even talking about 5.1 here. For basic stereo, what you need is to multiply this by 2. Okay. So for stereo recording, you will need this number, well, this is an approximation anyway, but you have to multiply this by 2, which means you end up with 720 megabytes.
Was it Dolby more than stereo though?
Sorry?
Dolby, is that,
Adobe?
yeah, is that better than
You
stereo?
format surround sound, Dolby.
Oh, Dolby. Surround sound is a different mechanism. I'm not
So it's
100%
kinda like
sure.
the same process?
Well, when you say Dolby, there are different things. The company made several products. One is called a noise reduction. When we still had audio tapes. Do you still remember audio tapes, people? No? Some of you do. Okay. Some of you might have seen one in the closet somewhere and go like, what is this? When you were a kid, you just pull all the tape out and go like, wow, that is fun. And then your parent would come home and go like, what did you do? That's my favorite cassette. What is a cassette?
I remember vinyl.
Vinyl. Okay.
Vinyl.
Now vinyl is a whole different story. Yep.
They-
Okay, so you were saying we need 2 times the sampling, right?
No, because for stereo recording, there are 2 channels.
No,
This-
before that.
Oh, before that?
Yeah.
Yes. If you want to represent up to 20 kilohertz, sounds of up to 20 kilohertz, the sampling rate has to be twice of that in order to represent 20 kilohertz in a good way. Yep. So the sampling frequency has to be twice of the highest frequency that you want to be able to store.
Okay.
All right, and then this multiplied by 2 has to do with 2 channels instead of 1. This number, does it look kind of suspiciously familiar to some of you who have bought CDRs and CD rewrites and stuff like that? Yes? Okay. That's exactly why, because those storage devices or the optical discs are designed to store 1 hour and sometimes a little bit more than an hour of audio using 16-bit per sample stereo and 44.1 kilohertz sampling rate.
I believe it was like 72 minutes. It was like 72 minutes.
Yeah, the 72 minutes have 800 megabytes in terms of raw data storage, so that's why they're slightly higher compared to this one. Okay, and that's CD. This is the standard used by audio CDs. So when you go to a store, back in the past, to go to a store and buy a CD, this is how music is encoded in those CD. It is not encoded in any way. It is really just recorded, digitized, and recorded, and that's it. Any questions at this point?
That's pretty, it looks complicated, but I didn't know any of that. Now I'm like, yeah, that's so cool.
Now, the next question is, if you are streaming music, okay, would this be a good, streaming rate? Okay, so we want to now calculate, if you are to stream music using 44.1 kilohertz as a sampling rate, 16-bit per sample, and stereo, okay, what kind of internet connection do you need in order to transmit all that, music to your, computer? Yep.
If you want to do it properly, you'd have to have it at least 72 bytes per second, right?
Well, you need 4. Okay, let's do the calculation here. This is how many bytes per second, but you have 2 channels, right?
Yeah.
Let's see. I'm multiplying this by 2. That should be okay. So that would give us 88,200 bytes, per. Oh wait. Okay. The first times 2 has to do with 2 bytes per sample because it's a 16-bit sample, so you
And
need
the
2
second
bytes per
one for
sample.
stereo?
The second one is for stereo. So we have to double this number by 2, which is, oh man, I cannot do the multiplication.
176 2.
4.
170.
172,
6.
176400. So this is the number of bytes that we need to transmit per second in order to stream music using this particular method. Okay? Now when you are streaming music, are you measuring usually by number of bits per second or number of bytes per second? Well, you mentioned that question a little bit earlier. Did you mention byte rate or bit rate? It is bit rate. Okay, the correct term is bit rate. So if you want to look at the bit rate, how many bits do we have per byte? There are 8 bits per byte. Okay, so the bit rate will be this number multiplied by 2. So we have 176,00400 times 8. We have this one as the bit rate.
So when they record music, they take all this in consideration. When they record music, they take all this into consideration, so they get the best quality and sound.
That is correct. When they record music, sometimes they record it
And
at.
they're doing all this at the same time, right? As they're recording it.
Yes, this is the standard for recording.
Right.
So they have to use 16-bit per sample, stereo, and sampling at 44,100 hertz per second. 44,100 times per second.
And then after the recording's done, can they change that to make it sound like more crystal clear?
They can do certain things, but that won't be truthful anymore. It's kind of like when you have like a stereo system, you can have a natural sounding speaker system where things are just the way it was recorded. But you can also boost the bass. Some people really like to boost the bass, so they put like 600 watts into the bass speaker. Then it is distorted because it's no longer, it doesn't sound like the original sound anymore.
So basically all the changes you do, you have to do when the recording's going on.
No, the recording is really just recording exactly what the microphone is experiencing. Okay, you're just recording the voltages coming out of the microphone, and whatever it was, you just record it as truthfully as possible. Okay. Now, if you want to amplify a portion of the frequency, you can do so when you are playing back the audio, the soundtrack or the recording. When you're playing it back, then you can actually do the boost of the treble, and also you can boost the bass and subdue the mid-range, or do whatever you want with an equalizer. Yep, go ahead.
Why did you times it by 8?
Because there are 8 bits per byte. So we are changing bytes per second into bits per second, and that's why we need to multiply that by 8.
Oh, okay.
Okay? So we're changing the units because bits per second is more commonly used to measure how much bandwidth you need to stream music from the internet to whatever device you want to use to listen to music. Okay? All right, so this number, is kind of big, because, we have to remember to put all the commas to the right places. So we are talking about approximately 1.4 megabits per second, okay? Some people do not have that kind of connection speed to the internet altogether, let alone, streaming at this particular bit rate, to get the music. Yep.
When they talk about internet download speeds, are they talking in megabits or megabytes?
It depends, when you're talking about download speed, most of the time they use byte per second, because when we look at the size of a file, we measure by bytes. But when you're streaming, which means you're not really storing, then they use bit per second, because that's the more common unit to measure bandwidth, network bandwidth.
And bytes is a capital B, right?
Yes, if you use bytes per second, you're using the uppercase B. When you use bits per second, you're using the lowercase b. That is correct. Very good. Okay, so we have a really big problem here, because this is approximately 1.4 megabits per second. So once again, this lowercase b represents bit and not byte. This uppercase m here is representing mega instead of milli, which is lowercase m. Yep, go ahead.
Is this where people in the music industry, they sample people's music and they check it for the right bytes or whatever? So if they're sampling to make sure it's not their same music? That's when they they adjust it like that?
No, this doesn't have anything to do with copyright infringement testing. This has to do with when they're transmitting the music to you. Let's say you purchase some music from Amazon, okay, and you want to listen to the music, streaming it. This is this is the bandwidth, or this is the transmission rate that you will need if we are to transmit the music using 16-bit per sample and 44.1 thousand samples per second, and stereo. Yep, go ahead. Go ahead.
I want to make sure I understand. So you're saying 1,000 bits is 1 kilobit?
Yes. Okay. Let's talk about the units here. 1 kilo is 1,000. 1 mega is 1 billion. 1 giga is 1 billion. So those are the units. Lowercase k for kilo for 1,000, uppercase m for million for mega, and uppercase G for giga or 1 billion.
There's tera.
And then there's tera now, 1 T, uppercase T for 1 tera, which is 1, what is it, trillion? Okay. Okay. So those are the abbreviation of units, typically used by engineers. Scientists like to say, okay, we want this number multiplied by 10 to the power of something. But engineers just like these particular units. Yep.
The rock point
Mhm.
is
Million
the one
bits per
bit.
second.
Because we just take one decimal, so we came to the 6. Take to the 6 is per minute. Instead of
Correct. Yes.
extracting-
Yep. That's the other way to look at it. Yep. Go ahead.
What's the T again?
T is for tera. T-E-R-A. Yep. After tera is what? Peta? Is it peta? P-E-T-A?
Yeah.
Okay. We're not quite there yet, but I think in about 10 years, we'll be talking about, petabyte hard drives. I have no idea why people would need hard drives that big. Yep. I just want to, encode all my, CDs, my collection of CD, which is about 40. So everything I need, I can store everything within like, a few gigabytes, at the most. Yep.
What's the difference between MP3 format and FLAC?
Okay, we'll talk about that next because what you're talking about is totally related to what we are talking about here. Because this is a very unreasonable bit rate. What is a much more reasonable bit rate when you listen to radio online or stream music? Come on, you guys know it.
320
Well, okay, most people. Okay, so let me just kind of break this up a little bit here. 128 kilobits per second is a quote unquote reasonable bit rate for most music purposes. Okay. And that has to do with most people do not have high-speed connection that can support continuously 1.4 megabits per second. 128 kilobits per second is doable for most people. Okay, 3G connection can do that. Okay, but 1.4 megabits per second, I don't think that's a 3G type of connection. There has to be a 4G connection at least. Okay. So what are we talking about here? This is the bit rate that is reasonable. If you want to listen to music, we don't want to tie up your cell phone so it cannot do anything except to download the music or to stream the music. So 128 kilobits per second is a reasonable compromise, for that sort of thing. So what about 192 kilobits per second and all the other bit rates? Okay, so 192 is the other one that's common, and 256 is considered a high quality bit rate for most purposes. In other words, most of the time we don't have to exceed 256 kilobits per second, or most people cannot tell the difference anymore. Okay, so why do we have 256 kilobits per second considered high quality already when we had this calculation a little bit earlier, giving us 1.4 megabits per second. Now 1.4 megabits per second, if you want to look at it from the perspective of kilobit per second, is 1400 kilobits per second. So you look at this number, 1400 here, and look at this number here, only 256. Why there's such a big difference? And most people will claim that you cannot tell the difference between CD type of encoding using this bit rate and also compressed music using this particular bit rate. So that is the question, okay? How do we compress music so that instead of using 1400 kilobits per second, Now we can just use 256 kilobits per second, so you still have bandwidth left to browse the web and do all the other stuff that you do with your smartphones. Yep, go ahead.
Something to be noted of
It's more to compress. Actually, if I think of compression, you're not trying to move range, you're just trying to move like extra spaces.
No, that's not actually true. You are actually compressing and losing some stuff. Yep, go ahead.
Well, when you have 256 kilobytes per second, you're not just losing sample rate and information, you're also losing things like dynamic range and
That's actually not entirely true either. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at what is compression. Okay, compression. Okay, it can turn 1.4 megabits per second to 256 kilobits per second. Okay, but how is that done? Well, there are two basic standards for compression, or I should say there's one industry standard for compression. What is it? When you listen to music, how is it encoded? What is the extension of the file? MP3. Okay, MP3 is the quote-unquote de facto standard for music or audio compression. Now, when it's compressing, what it's really doing is analyzing the waveform, and then it is trying to use a different representation to represent the sound that you are actually recording. What we are experiencing, what we are hearing, let's say we're hearing music from an orchestra, what you're really hearing is a combination of a lot of different frequencies overlapped. Okay, so you have many different frequencies overlapping. This particular method is encoding everything in what we call the time domain, which means we're really just looking at every single point and say how can we best represent every single point over time, and we want to sample or we want to record these points 44,100 times per second. Okay, this is as raw as it gets. Okay, this is the raw data. MP3 is a little bit different. It basically looks at sound as a combination of different frequencies, and it's really just recording how much of this frequency, how much of that frequency, how much of that frequency do we have over time, and therefore it can actually compress the wave because it's not really representing the sine wave itself as individual points. It's really just saying, oh, we got one particular presence of a certain frequency of this amplitude, and that's it. And that's why it is using a lot less resources to represent the same information. There was a hand somewhere. Yep, go ahead.
I have a radio station app that I'm listening to, and it gives you an option to play from 32 kbps or 28 kbps. What's the difference? Did you go get a difference or not?
Some people can and some people cannot. It also depends on the genre of music that you're listening to.
So, like a talk show.
For a talk show, probably doesn't make as much of a difference. Okay, because we have really amazing ways to interpret speech. So if you're just listening to someone talking, you don't need a very high bit rate. In fact, your cell phone itself is using 8 kilobits per second for transmitting voice data. Okay, and it's not really good, because you cannot hear all the nuances of the other side, but it's good enough that you can carry on the conversation. Okay, so for voice purposes, 8 kilobits per second is usually considered sufficient. It doesn't give you really high quality, but it's good enough for normal conversations and for talk shows. For music, on the other hand, 128 kilobits per second is really kind of considered the minimum. Because if you go any lower than that, it doesn't even depend on what kind of music you're listening to. It will still sound really kind of crappy, compared to the original. And there was another hand. Go ahead. Oh, I think he's doing some research. Yep, go ahead.
So something you're saying is when music is compressed in MP format, quality degrades or quality is lost.
Not necessarily. It depends on what you are encoding. I can give you one example that can illustrate everything that we were just talking about. Okay. So forget about sound and sine waves and stuff like that. Let's look at a circle. Okay, circles. All right. So let us think about how do we represent a circle, okay? Now when we represent a circle, we can just say, oh, there's an easy way to represent a circle, right? This is the center, okay? I need some way to represent the center, and here is the radius, and that's it, okay? The center and the radius. Two little pieces of information that will give me, that will let me draw a circle that is completely round and all that stuff, right? On the other hand, another way to represent a circle is to use a graph paper. Right? So when you use a graph paper to basically plot a circle, then you're saying, oh, there's a dot here, a dot here, a dot here, one dot here, one dot here, one dot here, one dot here, and so on. Then you need a lot more, you would need to chew up a lot more memory in the computer to represent all the dots that the perimeter of a circle is going to land on. Is that making any sense? Using the dots to represent a circle is the raw method of representing music, because all you're doing is sampling. Now, how truthful you can draw a circle using this method has to do with how many dots you want to allocate. The more dots, the rounder the circle, and it looks better, right? The fewer dots, in fact, you can turn this whole thing into a single dot, right? This is my dot. Yes, this dot has a color, and that's my circle. What circle? I cannot see a circle, because your resolution is way too low to represent what you want to represent. Okay, so that is the same thing as representing sound wave using this particular method. What about the other method? What about the method of looking at it as, oh, here's the center of the circle. We'll call it x and y, and here is the radius. Now we know how to draw the circle, right? Given these two little pieces of 3 numbers, we can now say, oh, but I know what a circle is. Now I know how to draw a circle, a perfect circle at that too. Okay, this is MP3. MP3, okay, of course this is the analogy, okay? It's not exactly what MP3 does, but the analogy is in MP3 encoding, you are only using very core information to represent something, okay? And therefore, 3 numbers, 1, 2, 3, you're done, okay? But when you use this method, then you need to know the xy of this pixel, the xy of this pixel, the xy of this pixel, this pixel, this, blah, 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 blah. So you need a lot more information. You need to store a lot more data points to represent the same thing. Yep.
So for MP3, that means at one time it was MP2 and MP1.
Yes, there are the MPEG, 1 and MPEG 2. Those are different standards. MPEG stands for Motion Picture Something Group. Okay, look it up.
Does that mean the compression rate got better with time as
There we go.
As computers got faster and were able to store more on the computer?
You mean the number, the MPEG number?
Yeah.
No, it has to do with the method that we are encoding. And that's the math of encoding is way beyond the scope of this class. But we are basically discovering better algorithms, better ways to encode music, and better math to do it. A lot of the math requires a lot of heavy-duty computation power, which we did not have before. But now that we have those, we can actually do encoding in a very compressed format and not lose a lot of quality. MPEG, stands for the Moving Picture Experts Group, okay? And that's where MP3 comes from, because MPEG3, which is for encoding video, which includes your audio and also video content, the audio compression method is now known as MP3. So it's really just one component of MPEG3, but we only use that component for music encoding, and therefore it becomes the de facto standard for just for audio compression. Yep. I forgot to bring my roll sheet with me, so everybody is not absent today.
So the bitrate, that's specifically referring to MP3 files.
Anything that is compressed.
So like is FLAC compressed at all?
FLAC, FLAC, yes. FLAC is actually compressed, but it is a lossless compression. Okay, so let me go back here and talk about what is lossy and what is lossless compression. Okay, Okay, so we have two perfect circles here, and you can see how the MP3 method is doing a perfect encoding of the original item, whereas this method here is, well, it's an approximation, but it's not exactly the same thing as the original item. Let's go ahead and make this a little bit more complex. What if the shape is Mickey Mouse? Okay, let's talk about Mickey Mouse. So I'll just go ahead and erase this and draw Mickey Mouse. And Disney can sue me just by drawing 3 circles. I'm infringing on their copyright. I'm not kidding. They will sue people who draw like this, something like this, and put it into a product. Then this is a lawsuit waiting to happen.
Disney is very protective.
Yes, they are. Yep. So let's say we are trying to draw a shape like this. Okay. This is the method using the individual pixel method. So we are just saying, oh, these are the pixels that have to be black and so on. Okay. The other method is to basically say, oh, we have 3 circles here. One starts here and with a radius like this. One starts here with a radius like this. One starts here with a radius like this, right? But then we also have to remember there's nothing here and there's nothing here. So that means this approximation is no longer the same thing as the other one, because this approximation can only draw whole circles. Okay. So this is the shape to be drawn when you use this particular encoding method, whereas the original one can be kind of more truthful without the lines, where the ears are located. Are we doing okay so far? Okay. So once you encode it using the MP3 method, sometimes what you are reproducing is no longer the original item. And this compression method is called lossy, L-O-S-S-Y, which means you're losing some information in the process of encoding. Are we doing okay so far? In terms of the term itself, lossy. Okay. So if I go back to, yep.
Would the lost information be significantly noticeable?
That depends on how far you want to compress it.
Gotcha.
Okay, so lossy compression means you lose details in the compressed representation. Okay. A lower bitrate compression means more details lost. In other words, if your internet connection is really kind of slow, but you still want to listen to music, you can trade off. Okay, you can basically trade off quality for a lower bit rate. So this way, you can still listen to your music. It's not going to be close to the original, but nonetheless, it will still work over a slower network. On the other hand, if your network speed is really good, then you can go for a higher bit rate, encoding, which means you would chew up more bandwidth. You cannot do as much, you cannot do as much of other things you want to do with your network, but at the same time, the quality of the sound will be better. Are we doing okay so far? High bit rate means not as lossy. Low bit rate means well, it's kind of lossy. It's okay? Kind of. Okay, so now we can talk about different formats. Okay, I'm actually digressing into some other topic that is included in the curriculum, but it is not planned in topic 2. So once again we are kind of branching off, but because it is so closely related to what we have talked about so far. So MP3 is good. Yep, go ahead.
Did you answer the question? How compressed?
How it is compressed? The picture. So instead of representing Mickey Mouse or the outline of Mickey Mouse using these individual dots or the coordinates of these individual dots, I'm representing it using only 3 circles. And each circle is only 3 numbers because you just need the x, y for the center and then the radius of the circle. But because of that, this is no longer the original Mickey Mouse because these lines here are not supposed to be there. And that's why this is quote unquote a lossy compression, because it is losing some details or losing some information in the original picture. Any questions about lossy compression versus not lossy compression? Okay, MP3 is lossy. Okay, that is without a doubt. It is always lossy. There's another format. It's open source. It's called OGG Vorbis, VORBIS. It's also lossy. How many people have heard of the OGG Vorbis? Okay, in what context?
Usually using torrents.
Okay, your torrents, and also games. Okay, what about you?
Games.
Games. Okay. So the question now is, why do you think games would use, OGG Vorbis, instead of MP3?
Open source.
Because it is open source. Yep. Was that your answer?
Free.
Yep. It is free. Free is a better way to describe it, because this is a method of doing something. So it's not really quote unquote open source, but it is not patented. Okay. The MP3 encoding method is what we call patented, which means, if you use the same method to encode music, you're infringing on the patent. Okay, and there was a big thing, in the past, whether we can actually use MP3 encoders that are not licensed from the original author or whatever company that owns the license. Okay, so it was kind of like a gray area. You may be sued, because you are encoding your CD into MP3 files using your own tools, but they never really sued anyone, as far as I know. But there's always that kind of looming, legal issue, and that's why MP3 was really kind of, if people can avoid using MP3 in a commercial setting, they will. And that's why we also have LAME, L-A-M-E. Okay. I'll just kind of show you this, because I just find it kind of interesting. So L-A-M-E, which is LAME, okay? But LAME is not lame at all. LAME has its name. Okay, let me see. Where's the LAME ain't? Oh. They don't really have about LAME. Maybe it's there, right there. This is why LAME is called LAME, because they say LAME ain't an MP3 encoder, but it is. So the name of the product actually is a play of what it is, and rather than what it is not. Okay, this is a library that actually allows you to encode music from whatever source that is coming in from into MP3 format. But because of the legal issue, the patenting issue, they decided to name the product LAME to make it kind of obvious that no, we are not doing MP3 encoding, but they actually are. Yep.
So when something is in MP3 format becomes lossy, can you unloss it?
No. Once information is lost during the encoding process, you can never gain it back. It is not the same as distortion. Distortion sometimes you can undistort, but with lossy compression, whatever you lose, you can no longer get it back.
So our CDs, when they come in MP3 format, that's the best that it will be.
No, CDs are not. CDs are using the 44.1 kilohertz sampling rate, 16-bit per sample stereo. That is the standard of CDs. So when you talk about CD, like an audio CD, it is always encoding using that particular method. Yep.
Is there a name for that format, or is that just...
It's also known as WAV, W-A-V. Now, but WAV is different, okay? WAV is a family of encoding methods. So this is only one particular branch of what we know as WAV, W-A-V. Yep.
The standard for CD audio, which actually does have a name, is Redbook.
It's called Redbook?
Redbook audio.
Okay, thank you.
That's what they call standard.
But it is a WAV file.
Yes.
So they use the WAV file as a container, but the standard itself has its own name. Okay, thank you. Very good. So anyway, this is the reason why most games, when they distribute soundtracks and stuff like that, they do not use MP3 to encode it because they don't want to get into any type of legal issues as far as using the MP3 method, because that particular method is patented. OGG Vorbis is a similar method. It is not exactly the same because otherwise it would have been an infringement on the MP3 patent already. So people who want to read about it can just search for it. It's called OGG Vorbis. And most people just call it OGG, which is incorrect because OGG only refers to the container format, but not the actual encoding method. But that's kind of fine point to most people. Okay. So if you want to find out more about OGG Vorbis, go to this website here. There are car stereos and portable players now that can actually play music encoded in OGG Vorbis. Okay. So given the choice between MP3 and OGG Vorbis, which one should you choose when you can choose either one? Well, that's a very good question. And many people have tried to quantify the encoding quality of different formats. In other words, let's just say that my target is always 128 kilobits per second. This is all that I want to allocate of my bandwidth to listen to music. So the next question is, should I use MP3, OGG Vorbis, or is it called ACC, the Apple format, AAC? Okay, so the question is, how do those particular standards compare? And you can search for that, if you want to read about it. So all you have to do is to look for MP3, Vorbis, AAC, comparison. And there are websites, dedicated to the studying of different, compression mechanisms, and try to find out which one is better or how they compare. So any one of these websites, is a good resource, to do that sort of thing.
When you record sound for music and then sound for like a TV show, are they basically done the same way, or is there a difference?
When they are transmitted, they're encoded. And for audio encoding, they're all basically using a similar method to MP3 or Vorbis.
Like when you record sound and then you record the picture, is it
right? Those are recorded in different quote-unquote channels. So there's one channel for the picture.
The same concept though?
Similar, but not the same, because a picture is two-dimensional, whereas sound wave is one-dimensional. But they use a similar concept to encode pictures. Yep. So for people who want to really get into this type of discussion, there are people who you can actually see how they look at the encoded waveform, and when it is decoded, is it even close to the original and stuff like that. So if you are an audiophile and you want to get the most out of your collection, your encoded collection, you might want to read this part here. The only thing I can say is OGG Vorbis is very competitive. It is actually better than MP3, but it may not be better than some of the newer file formats from Microsoft, WMA. Now, WMA, which stands for Microsoft Media Audio, is also an entire family of encoding methods. So inside you will find things that are uncompressed at all, compressed but not lossy, compressed and lossy, and then specific ones only intended for voice but not for general purpose encoding. So that's the WMA, which is Windows specific or Microsoft specific. All right, so are we doing okay so far in terms of understanding encoding in this case? We are taking something that is recorded like this, the raw input, and we are trying to use as little bits to represent the same thing as possible, even though sometimes we lose some details. For those of you who are audiophiles, what do you lose? What do you realize first? In terms of the lossy part. Clipping. Okay, that's one.
And dynamic range.
Dynamic range is, I don't know whether you lose dynamic range, but you do. Okay. But when you're actually listening, what can you feel? What do you perceive? Yep.
I also perceive something called a sound stage, where the greater the bit rate that you have in your MP3 file, the more of a three-dimensional presence you can feel. So if you're listening to an orchestra piece, you can actually it gives off an illusion of a room where you can actually hear individual pieces of instruments if at a higher bit rate.
Okay,
so if you're listening to lossless audio, you hear percussion in the back, you can actually detect it going in the back. It's kind of like how Dolby surround sounds used for gaming, where if you hear shots fired off to your left side at a farther distance versus shots fired next to you, you can actually your mind actually perceives that.
Okay.
But I think it's something you do at a higher bit rate for lossless. I mean, for lossy, it doesn't really have that kind of.
Okay. So basically, what you're losing would be the details in the sound, because that's because the high frequency stuff, and also the phase of the high frequency stuff is what is allowing your ears or your brain, actually your brain to quote unquote triangulate the location or the source of a sound. So when that is distorted or lost completely, then you can no longer locate the source of the sound. Okay, so that's very good. I never thought of it in terms of a sound stage, but that's exactly what it is.
That's why whenever I'm playing a game, if I'm wearing headphones with Dolby surround sound, I actually do a lot better versus not having headphones on, because I can't triangulate where shots are coming from.
Ah, very interesting. Okay. Well, we do have one more standard to talk about, MP3, org verbiz, there's AAC used almost exclusively by Apple, and that's FLAC, okay? FLAC is not a lossy compression, it is what we call a lossless compression. So we can also use the other term, which is lossless. Okay. So when you look at FLAC, just look up FLAC, that's basically what it is. FLAC stands for Free Lossless Audio Codec. Codec is a term that is commonly used to basically refer to transcoding, type of standards, because it stands for codec stands for coder decoder. CO comes from coder, and DEC comes from decoder. So it's basically a mechanism to encode something and then decode it later on back to the original signal.
Would a FLAC file be significantly larger than the same MP3 file?
It is one half of, usually, okay, depending on the music, it is usually one half of the original size. So when you look at a CD, we just calculated with a CD, it's about 700 megabytes for about 1 hour's worth of recording. So using FLAC, you get about 350 megabytes. So you're only compressing it to one half of the original size, not even close to MP3 at 128 bits, kilobits per second. But then this is lossless. Okay, you do retain every single detail in the original sound. I think FLAC is probably also used a lot in games too, because it is a open source or a patent-free standard. Yep. Go ahead.
You said that Apple uses AAC, their own
container format, right?
Then why is it if I were to copy a file from iTunes onto the desktop, it'll show MP3 on there?
That's the original file. It's just that iTunes is just encoding that MP3 into some format,
Okay, let's see if I can bring this page up. So it has more details. Now we are going into an area where copyrights and what is that thing called? DDR becomes important. Okay, digital right management, DRM. Sorry, not DDR. DRM is important. Okay, so this is advanced audio coding. AAC is typically used by Apple products. It has lossy, and I think it might have variants that are not lossy. But you can read the rest from Wikipedia. It's really a little bit different in terms of the encoding. It's using 48. It supports inclusion of 48 full bandwidth audio channels in one stream. Blah 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 blah. That's the container format itself. The encoding part is somewhere else. Okay, so here comes another question. Okay, we have all these different formats. But what about DRM? What is DRM? Yep.
Digital rights management.
Digital rights management. But what is the intention of DRM?
mainly to prevent you from sharing files with the internet.
With yourself too, yes. Go ahead.
I was going to say anti-piracy.
Anti-piracy, yep, it's called digital rights management because they want to manage your right to, as far as, copyrighted content is concerned. Okay, but the next question is, how does it work? Okay, so can someone give me an example of DRM at work? Okay, if something is DRM'd, okay, what can't you do? Yep.
Like with games, you have to be online in order to play them because it has like a activation where you have to go to the server.
Okay, but what about DRM'd media content like music and video stuff? Go ahead.
It mentions earlier in this article the MP4, which is, as I understand it, basically the MP3 with that protection on it.
Okay. Well, MP4 is a container, format. So how you encode stuff in the inside is up to the encoder. Is up to the codec itself. Yep.
Does the DRM just make it difficult to rip or to copy?
Correct. Okay. So in the good old days, you can download, even with Amazon today, you can download an MP3 file, and you can play it on your own computer. You can send the file to yourself, so later on you can check your email on your cell phone and be able to play the music from the cell phone. If you are not conscientious about your copyright laws, you can also send it to a friend, and your friend would have no problem playing that file, right? That's a regular plain MP3 file. With DRM, it means it will only play on certain devices, usually the device where you made the purchase. Okay? How many people have an experience with trying to play a DRM'd audio file on a device, on another device, and it would not do it? Okay? You can copy the file all you want. You can send the file all you want. You can torrent the file all you want, but it will only play on one single device. So the question now is, how does that work? Go ahead.
If you're talking about container files, I imagine that there's an extra bit of code in there that computers can play back on multiple devices, right?
No, it has to do with encryption. Okay, this is actually a case of key pair encryption. Okay, so I can briefly explain that. The rest of the time of today is probably a good time to explain key pair encryption and how it is applied to DRM, digital rights management. Okay, so here is a DRM with key pair encryption. So we have DRM, which stands for Digital Rights Management. And it's based on, some DRM is based on encryption or key pair encryption. There we go. Okay. So this is really kind of interesting. So I would try to divide it into the different steps involved when you purchase music, and it is DRM, digital right managed. Okay. So step one, so you select the music, track. So you select a track and made the purchase. So you have PayPal or a credit card or whatever, you pay for it. The next thing is your computer will request to download the audio file. But in the process of requesting, this is what is going to happen. So your computer transmits a, I would call this key A, in the key pair encryption. So it will transmit key A to the content provider. In this case, a content provider can be a record company, can be whoever is owning the copyright or distributing the music is the content provider in this case. The content provider would use key A to encrypt the music. So the content provider uses key A to encrypt the music track. Point 4, the encrypted music track is transmitted to your computer/device, because it can be an iPad, iPod, iPad, or your Android phone, whatever. It doesn't matter what it is, but it is transmitted back to your device. Now here comes the really fun part, Because the track is encoded using key A, it means it cannot be decoded using key A. It has to be decoded using the other key. Because the whole concept of a key pair encryption is you have two keys. Whenever you have key A, there's also a key B. What you lock up using key A can only be unlocked using the other key. Okay? So now, you're, okay, so on the device, on your device, okay, on your authorized device, it uses key B, the other of the pair, to decipher the encrypted file, and you get to enjoy your music. Okay? But what if you transmit this track to another device? The other device does not have key B, and therefore it cannot decode the music. Yep.
So if you reset your cell phone to manufacturer setting or reformat your hard drive, you got to repurchase it again.
Not necessarily. It depends on which key or how it gets its key. Okay. So here's the really interesting part. Okay, it's no big deal, right? I mean, your computer will transmit key A to the content provider, and because key A is transmitted to the content provider, that means it is pretty easy to get to key A. Okay, this is the easy key to get to. It's probably even easily accessible from your own computer. But the problem is what you encode using this key, you cannot unlock using the same key. So it is only useful for encoding or encrypting something. It's useless to decrypt the same thing that is already encoded. You need this key to actually decode or decipher the content that is encoded using this particular key. So the question now is, why can't I access key B and make it available to my other devices and transmit it to all my friends, so now we can share music again? That is the question. Does anyone have the answer to that? Yep.
Is it using a device ID to identify the device?
It's inside the device, but it's not the device ID. Yep.
I thought it was just I was just thinking what you thought was this key. It's like each key pair would be unique.
Right.
Generated, so.
But if you have the key pair, you have the key pair.
If you have a randomly generated key A and then you have a randomly generated key B.
But they make a pair, so that means if you can somehow get to the entire pair, and then you can share the entire pair with other people, and as a result, the DRM is not going to work. So the question now is, why is key B impossible to get to, or at least for a normal person? Because it is inside your processor. Okay, it is inside your Intel or AMD processor, and you cannot read it. Okay, as a part of your processor, okay, you can basically say, okay, here is content that is already encrypted using the public key. Key A is also called a public key because everybody can have it. Okay, and then your processor will internally decipher the content and then give you back the decrypted content, but it never gives you the key itself. Okay, look at it this way. Okay. Let's say I'm the processor here. Okay, so this part here is physically the processor. All right. So what I'll do is I'm going to say, oh, you guys want to know what is the public key? Key A in this case. No problem. I will advertise what is key A. No problem. This is key A here. Okay. Transmit this to the content provider. Transmit this to Sony, to all the other content provider, because they will use this key to encrypt the music before it is transmitted and stored on your computer, right? Okay. So now let's see, we have this file is representing the music that is encrypted using the key that I just showed you. But it is useless to you because it is encrypted. It's all gibberish of zeros and ones. Okay? So when you want to play the music, what you need to do is to say, okay, this is the entire pile. You cannot give the entire pile to the processor. So you give the processor one piece at a time. Okay? Now remember, this part here is the processor. I'm the processor here. So I'm going to get in my inbox, I'll get one little chunk that is encrypted. Okay? And then what I'll do is I'm going to open up my little lockbox here, look up my little thing. Ah, this is the decryption key. Okay, and I look at the content here and go, according to this decryption key, the deciphered content is going to be this. So I give you back the deciphered, decrypted content, and you can play this. This is the actual content that you can play. Did you ever get to this part? Can you ever get to this part? No. Okay? So that is why you cannot share music, is because this little piece here, which is what we call the private key, because this key you don't want to share with other people, you don't even have it. You cannot access it even though it is your computer. Because it is in silicon, buried really deep in the processor itself. Yep.
Is that the same as like I do music and I also do movie stuff? I had a friend of mine did some stuff on my computer to where everything that as far as music that I write and everything else, to where you can only put it on my computer unless I enter a certain code, to make a copy of it. Because if you try to make a copy of it, it'll turn around and start giving you errors to the whole track.
Okay, there are two separate things. One is Windows, being a supporter of DRM. Microsoft, can basically recognize from a file, okay? Because remember, this is a file that is already marked as copyrighted, right? Okay. So Microsoft, as an operating system, can look at this file and say, hey, I can see that this is copyrighted content, and you cannot make a copy of that. So you are basically stopped by the operating system. This is not even encryption, decryption kind of an issue. It is your operating system identifying this file being protected and decide not to make a copy of it.
And so whatever he did, he put in there where you can make a copy, but when you turn around and try to play it back,
right,
it will send you a lot of errors.
That has to do with the encryption key. So that part has to do with exactly what we just talked about, because unless it is on the same computer that has this particular key that goes along with the public key, private key. So if it is not on the same computer without this little piece, then the file cannot be played because nobody knows how to decrypt it or decipher. So what you experienced was exactly what DRM is. That's the way it is supposed to work. Okay? So I'll see you guys next Tuesday. Have a good weekend. And I'll type this stuff up too because this is all related to this course.